This is a quick recap on the trauma-informed webinar we did with Dr. Gene Behrens on the polyvagal theory of trauma-informed education. So the biggest idea here is that we're trying to shift our normal into more of a neural perspective in new ways, and trying to see things in new ways as music teachers, because this is really going to impact the way that we approach our teaching. So we probably already know about the impact of fight or flight responses that is already a part of the autonomic nervous system. You may also already know about the sympathetic and parasympathetic modes within the autonomic nervous system. But very briefly, just to recap, the sympathetic mode is the fight or flight mode, and it happens when the heart rate is elevated, when pupils are dilated, and the body is prepared for action. The parasympathetic mode, on the other hand, is often referred to as the wait and think it out mode. So it's the mode that's engaged when we take a deep breath and we enter a mode that calms our bodies down, slows things down so that we have more time to engage our cognition around some kind of event that's happening. Now, the polyvagal theory, developed by Steve Porges, is a theory that extends and deepens our understanding by naming three modes: the sympathetic mode, and then within the parasympathetic, the dorsal mode and the ventral mode. The ventral mode is our mode of human connection. It is a mode that allows us to attend to facial features, eye contact, and engage in social connection. Now, the dorsal mode is quite the opposite. If you have ever seen an animal roll over and play dead, that is exactly what the dorsal mode is. It is a system in which we retreat lower into our digestive tract, and our bodies kind of shut down and shut out stimuli. It's a way that kind of deadens our sensory perceptions in an effort for us to feel less pain and angst. It's a mechanism that helps us to retreat. You may have recognized this mode from maybe some of the students that you've worked with in the past. Now, in the past, we've often talked about either clients in music therapy or students within our classrooms. We might say, oh, that student is out of control. That student is defiant. That student can't control themselves. They don't care about anything. They're lazy. They've checked out. And when we think about these kinds of labels and this language that we use, we recognize that especially once we've really understood the literature on trauma-informed care, these kinds of labels seem to misconstrue our perceptions of students, especially students who've encountered some kind of trauma. Because all of these phrases mean that the student is to blame. Essentially we're asking this question about what is wrong with this student. And instead, Dr. Behrens recommends that we need to shift our perspective to think about how a student's nervous system hijacks their systems and responses. And in trauma-responsive care, the student is not rationally to blame, but they are rather acting by instinct as their autonomic nervous system hijacks their ability to think, process, and respond. So Dr. Behrens encourages us to use the language of activators rather than triggers, language that I'm really grateful for from my peace-building lens, and to think about how a particular moment, an event, a consequence, a situation can activate an immediate behavioral risk response without the student even thinking rationally about what is happening. And when we talk about the vagus nerve, we're really talking about a vagal nerve that is one of the longest nerves in our body. It's a nerve that moves all the way from our face down into our digestive system. And in this mini webinar, we're talking about polyvagal theory, recognizing that the nerve is essentially a bundle of fibers, the polyvagal, that operates all the way through our body. And I think it's really important because it is a system that helps us to understand that our cognition or our idea of thinking is not just contained in the brain, but really we process things throughout our entire body. So when a child is in their sympathetic nervous system, the body is preparing for a very dramatic action. One response of this system can all of a sudden bring a child into a fight. And you may notice that a student who has experienced trauma in their life may be more aggressive and more unpredictable in their response to an activator. So we need to talk about a term that's called the vagal brake. The vagal brake is in some ways a metaphor for our ability to flip back out of the sympathetic nervous system into our ventral mode of social connection. The vagal brake enables us to smile, talk, interact, and learn. And when we encounter an interruption or something that suddenly moves us in to a different mode when we don't feel safe, we use our vagal brake to flip back out of the sympathetic mode and return us back to social engagement. We all are constantly moving from fight to flight response to dorsal mode to ventral mode throughout our entire days. And a healthy child or adult has mechanisms in which they can moderate their responses and bring themselves back through coping mechanisms, like a deep breath. So all throughout the day, we're modulating between these different modes. So we may start out in the ventral mode, and then we move down to the sympathetic mode, and then we may move back to the ventral mode. And maybe sometimes we need some introversion time, some time to kind of withdraw. And we move to the dorsal mode, and then we move back to the ventral mode. So healthy adults should be able to move back and forth very flexibly between all three of these modes. And we use this idea of the vagal brake as a way of moderating our motion through these different states. So what happens when a child who has experienced trauma loses some of their ability to apply the vagal brake and to develop some sense of regulation or control over these types of modes? So the idea of safety is key to Deb Dana's wonderful book on polyvagal theory, which I highly recommend that you take some time to read. She talks about the importance and the centrality of safety. So in an anxious child, the feeling of safety can often be very fleeting or hard to come by. When an anxious child's nervous system is hijacked, there may be some escape behaviors, emotional outbursts, difficulty expressing the self, trouble organizing motor responses, trouble having difficulty with authority, unable to read people in context, difficulty concentrating, or difficulties with hearing and processing information. All of these things can happen when a nervous system is hijacked. And it's really important to think about these things because, especially for me as a music teacher, the inability to hear sounds and process information, to concentrate, to learn, all of these things are going to be experienced and expressed within our classrooms. And as it relates to the dorsal system, maybe we see a child sitting with their head down, avoiding eye contact, pulling their body in physically, avoiding talking, refraining from playing with others. Maybe somebody who's not alert to sounds because oftentimes the sense of hearing is turned off in trauma situations. These are all symptoms of being withdrawn into the dorsal mode. So the question is, if we know all this, and if we know that the ventral mode is the place where we want to go, how do we bring students into a sense of safety? And how do we balance safety with challenge? Because we need both of these elements, safety and challenge, within a good classroom. In Dr. Barron's work, she has taught coping mechanisms like deep breathing, and we have a ton of great research and evidence that suggests that the deep breath does something magical for the autonomic nervous system. It seems to moderate the sympathetic nervous system and bring us back into kind of a parasympathetic state of being. It relaxes us, it lowers our heart rate, it does so many things well. So there may be a reason why choral teachers have known for a very long time about the power of the deep breath as a form of relaxation and tension and centering. And we also know that singing familiar or well-known songs can activate the reward network as another way of centering and moderating our responses. Other coping mechanisms that Dr. Barron's pointed out included repetitive hand clapping patterns and lummy stick patterns. So, one of the findings that I have been most fascinated by as we form the groundwork for our new master's program in music education, and especially with world music drumming, is the emerging research on synchrony and imitation. So, synchrony means any moment in which we coordinate our responses together. In music, it's typically through a beat. And there's something magical about being in synchrony with one another, like playing together in locked precision. And this points to one of the most important findings in polyvagal research. The regulation of the autonomic nervous system is more about co-regulation than self-regulation, especially among students who have experienced trauma. So let me say that again. The regulation of the autonomic nervous system is more about co-regulation than self-regulation. So what is co-regulation? Co-regulation means that someone else has to be in relationship with us and has to support our modulation between the dorsal, ventral, and sympathetic modes. Now, a teacher is not a therapist, but a teacher can be a key relationship that engages students in imitative practice, synchrony, and encouraging coping mechanisms like the magic of the deep breath. And really important is the recognition that when a student is in the sympathetic or dorsal modes, it is very difficult, if not impossible, for the student to rationally think themselves back into the ventral mode. What we need to do as co-regulators is to increase the safety of the space, breathe with these students until they are ready to emerge. When a traumatized student is back in the ventral mode, that is finally the place where we can rationally reflect on what happened and the tools that we used in those situations. But none of that conversation can happen in the moment of a full-blown sympathetic response. Now, Dr. Behrens in the webinar presented a number of other ideas for co-regulation. So some of these ideas can include things like teacher proximity and the use of voice. And one of the really interesting findings here that Dr. Behrens has relayed to me is that when directions are sung to students rather than spoken, this seems to add a feeling of safety, especially when it's done through a higher-pitched woman's voice. So in my teaching, instead of saying, let's go on to number 23, if I'm teaching a group of kindergartners, I might say, let's go on to number 23, as a sung way of transitioning between activities using a rhythmic, predictable, and tuneful voice. So to those who attended the webinar, someone made a really astute observation when they mentioned that many of the strategies for trauma appear to be equally applicable to autism. And that's exactly right, because there appears to be a really strong intersectionality between autism and trauma. And our strategies of predictability, safety, unconditional positive regard, and breaking tasks into small parts apply equally to both our work in trauma and to our work into autism. So that the context of this webinar gives us an invitation to reframe from naming a child as being out of control or at fault to recognizing the moments when a nervous system is hijacked, and then to create an environment that balances safety with challenge to support students through the work of co-regulation. And as we recognize the qualities and characteristics of dorsal, ventral, and sympathetic modes, we can build classrooms of connection and care through our awareness of the latest advances and understandings in polyvagal theory and the neurobiology of trauma and connection. So thank you for spending time with us today. This is a very brief overview over a very complex topic that we spent a great deal more time on in the official webinar. To learn more, consider looking at our new Master of Music Education program in Peace Building, where we will be exploring ethnomusicology, neuroscience, and social-emotional learning as we work to reclaim space for connection and care. Or consider subscribing to our professional development network at musicpeacebuilding.com for future webinars that will be offered, especially this fall of 2020.